Hey, John with the Conversation That Matters for January 17th, 2017. It's been a while since I made a video. It was actually the day after the election last year, and a lot has happened since then. And I've had a lot of thoughts on it. I just haven't had time to share any of them. So here we go. I could talk about a lot of things. I think what I want to focus on in this short video is the idea of libertarianism as a political philosophy. For those who don't know, libertarianism is the idea that there are two principles that should be applied to the government. One of the principles is the non-aggression principle, which is the idea that you don't really have the right to go steal or murder or harm anyone else, and that should be applied to governments. Governments can't invade other countries unless first they are invaded. So self-defense is okay, but that's about it. And the other principle is the idea of private property, that we can own ourselves. We own the property that we've obtained from the sweat of our brow or that's been given to us, and other people shouldn't interfere with that. And so it sounds good, right? Those are both probably principles that would correlate with conservative principles as well. I would pretty much agree with those. Now, conservatives would say those aren't the only principles, but those are two pretty good principles. Now, what is different between a libertarian and conservative? Why would I consider myself a conservative? Even though in the past I voted for a libertarian candidate, I've been listening a lot to a libertarian podcast over the past couple months. That's why it's been on my mind. And I would agree probably with the particular podcast I've been listening to, the Tom Woods Show. I would agree with the guy probably in 90% of things. But where's the difference? I think fundamentally it's not in the issues necessarily. It's more at the foundation. And some of the issues would I think, would show this to be true. And I'll give an example in a minute. But the foundation of libertarianism is kind of a humanistic one. Whereas for conservatism, it's more of a theonomic one, really. And I think I can sum it up in this statement. Libertarians confuse ownership with stewardship. I'll say it again. Libertarians confuse ownership with stewardship. And to give an example, libertarians would say, I own my body. I own the things that I've obtained. Conservatives would say, well, I own those things, but I own them because I'm a steward of them. In the sense that I manage them because God has given them to me. Now, in the Christian sense, in the Western world, we would go back to Genesis. God made Adam, or gave Adam the responsibility to keep and cultivate the earth, right? So Adam in the Garden of Eden is managing what God has given him. God has the rights over his creation, including man himself. Libertarians would deny that. Libertarians would basically say, well, we have the rights over ourselves. And so that's going to maybe not affect economics that much, the free market. Conservatives and libertarians have the same views of that, but when it comes down to social issues, there's going to be a difference sometimes. And even in libertarian camps, they will war with each other about these issues. And I'll give you an example, abortion. Ron Paul is pro-life. He believes that because of the non-aggression principle, you can't take the life of a fetus. It's just not right. It's murder. Conservatives would pretty much agree. He takes a conservative line on that. Now, there are other libertarians like Marie Rothbard who would say, well, no, not so fast. There's another principle here. And that's the principle of private property. The mother's womb is her private property, and she gets to do what she wants with it. The baby's her private property. It came from her. And so she can kill the baby anytime she wants. Now, there's other libertarians who would say, well, and these get wacky, I think, you can't kill the baby, but you can eject it from the womb, which in most instances would kill the baby. But they would try to get around it by balancing these two principles, because these two principles clash into each other, because they are not sufficiently balanced out by other principles that conservatives would believe in. Now, conservatives, because they believe that there's a blueprint for everything, they would look at other institutions like the family and say, well, that's important too. It's not just the state and the individual. Libertarians see those two institutions. But there's also the family. There's the church. And the family is something that has been in place since creation. There's clues in biology and psychology that show us that the family is a legitimate institution that needs to be preserved, that needs to be protected, that needs to be furthered. And the governments need to recognize that. Government should govern in such a way that the government recognizes that the families do exist, that there are parental rights, and that there are certain rules which apply to groups of people in the family unit that don't apply to them as individuals. That's a conservative view. And so this is going to really be the thing that makes self-government possible. That's why our founders, I believe, would have supported this. they would have said, we need self-government, which means we need institutions like the church and the family to step it up. And that will keep the greater government, the national government, from becoming totalitarian, which is true. That's what is going to keep men from really being tyrannical and stealing from their neighbors. So the non-aggression principle is actually better kept when you have these institutions in place. That's what conservatives believe. Conservatives will admit that there's a blueprint, that in creation, and that there's a creator that has ownership rights over his creation, and we're just here as stewards to apply the laws that he's given. Libertarians wouldn't really say any of that, at least if they're being true to their philosophy at the core. They would say that there are two fundamental principles that need to be applied, and everything else is basically a free-for-all. That I don't mean anarchy. What I mean is that you can do whatever you want with your private property. That within the bounds of your private property, that no one can tell you what to do. And so libertarians would a lot of them would view issues like abortion, like same-sex marriage, like even, I know I'm being vague, but the transgender stuff, even the open borders versus closed borders, differently. And libertarians also disagree on those things depending on what principle they happen to want to apply that day, whether the non-aggression or the private property principle. But conservatives at least have a foundation where they can kind of go back to say, this is the blueprint. This is how we are supposed to treat this institution, or this is the policy that we should enact in this case. And so the example I gave is abortion. I think it can clearly be seen. The conservatives would look at the mother and say, she's designed. She has a womb. There was an intention that a baby is supposed to be nurtured in this womb. The biological signs are all there. This is something that, furthermore, is given to us by special revelation. And so the government is actually put in place to protect that institution, to admit that this was designed in this way and is for this purpose, and the child, therefore, should be protected because of this. There is an intention. Libertarians would put that in the category of religion, and then they would try to, in the case of Ron Paul, come up with some kind of secular principle devoid of religion to be able to defend the life of the unborn. But you can see that he runs up against the principle of private property, and at least if it's being applied from a secular humanist viewpoint, which is really the undergirding principle behind libertarianism. It's secular humanism, that we start out as ourselves, that we start out owning ourselves. Now, let me give you, I think, what I believe is the Achilles heel here of a libertarian philosophy. And like I said, even though I agree with much of libertarianism, as far as the principles that they work out, rather the policies that they would enact, I would probably agree with like 80% of it. But the underlying philosophy, this is where it breaks down. There are two universal principles, they say, private property and non-aggression. Problem is, those two universal principles, how can they be universal in and of themselves? Well, let me flesh that out. The principle of private property says that individuals own themselves and get to basically determine whatever they want with their property. So individuals own themselves, individuals including their own minds, right? I own my own mind under this idea. Therefore, the principles in my mind are only they only apply to myself. I get to make the rules for me. And now you're telling me there's a universal rule? Well, how do you get a universal rule out of that? If every individual just owns themselves, I mean, that would imply that they also own their own thoughts. They have their view of truth. How do you get a universal standard if everyone has ownership over their own minds, and that's it? So you see the problem that exists here. And that's why I think libertarianism has an Achilles heel, a fundamental flaw. That's why I also think, though, that there's, and I'll end it in a positive way, that libertarianism has some good things to contribute in a way. The principle of non-aggression, the principle of private property are actually two very good principles. It's just that they're not the only principles. And that's where conservative critique would come in. There are the principle or the institution of the civil magistrate and the institution of the individual. Those are two legitimate institutions that interact with one another. And those two principles, the non-aggression and private property, should be used in that interaction. However, those aren't the only institutions. There's also the state, or rather not the state, the family. And there's also the religious institution, the church. And so conservatives would have a more, I think, healthy, fleshed out, nuanced, and perhaps even moral, well, there's really no doubt about it, moral view than a libertarian would have. And they have a view that would apply to everyone, because it starts with the idea that there's a creator that so you can have universal rules. Libertarianism doesn't really have that. They don't give a sufficient basis for it. And so that's why I can see why it would be tempting to be a libertarian, especially for young people who get to have all their liberal social views, but then they can do math in the economic realm and do it correctly. But ultimately, it's going to break down eventually. And if you're a libertarian watching this, I hope you'll think about this. I hope you'll think about the abortion issue that I just brought up. And think about those two principles, non-aggression and private property. And how are you going to decide what the right course of action is there? And think about the other critique I gave as well. Think about where a universal law, such as the non-aggression principle, would come from if ownership is in the hand of individuals alone. So ponder that, and I hope at least caused you to think and you enjoyed that. And until next time, have a good day.